Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm here to give the perspective of the private sector from a service provider perspective on the team, harnessing partnership for Africa's prosperity, bridging the data trust gap. The topic is important to us as an organization because if you go and look at our vision and our mission and our purpose as a company, prosperity of Africa is one of the things that we are passionate about. The topic is personally important to me because it talks about bridging the gap, right? Bridging the gap for Africa. And I think there are two gaps that we need to talk about when we bridge. We need to bridge the data gap between Africa and the rest of the world, and then we need to build a trust gap between the consumers and the producers of the data that we'll be talking about today. My presentation will be in about 3 parts. The first part, I need to talk about why Africa, why now, right? And I will share some perspectives of why that is important. The second part, I will talk about our journey as a company, illustrating the journey in Africa of data, its use, its importance, and why it is important for us to have the conversation that we're having here today. Then I'll talk about the topic itself, the data trust gap, the data gap, and what it is that we believe can be done to address those. Okay, so I'm struggling with this. I shouldn't be, because it was working. All right, thank you very much. I think I got it now. All right, awesome. So why Africa, why now? If you look at the growth of economies across the world, right? Africa's economy has expanded significantly over the past decade, right? If you look at the data that we're looking at, you will see that Africa as a continent has grown orders of magnitude more times than many of the other regions that we're basically considering. To the extent that I think 19 of the top fastest growing countries are out of Africa today, right? We also have a sizable population, over 1.4 billion as at a couple of days ago, and we continue to grow. The forecast actually says that Africa will become over half of the global population growth in 2050 will take place in Africa, with another 1.3 billion people being added to this continent in the next few years, right? So we have the people, we have the economic power, but beyond that, we're also beginning to see an expansion in digital internet penetration, right? With the internet penetration growing in the last, I would say in the last decade, from less than 10% to over 33% today, across a whole bunch of countries, right? These data points are basically telling us why Africa, why now, right? We have the people, we have the population, we're being more and more connected to the digital world. We're generating more and more data, and we will need to be able to transform our people, transform our economies, transform our industries using these assets that we've developed. Right. One of the biggest challenges, however, is that we know that globally the amount of data being generated is exponential, right? But the big question is, what about Africa's data, right? How much data is really being generated in Africa, and where is it? It's increasing, but is it increasing at the same rate as the rest of the world? What are the steps that we need to take as an industry, as a people, to change that disparity? And this, for me, is probably one of the important gaps that we need to figure out how to address. But we have started, right? The journey is ongoing. What have we done as a country, as a continent, as a company? One of the things I'm probably most proud about, and I'm just going to give about 2 or 3 examples. One of the ones I'm most proud about is what we've done in the area of financial inclusion in Nigeria, but generally in Africa, across the countries where we have presence: Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Gambia, and now the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have used the technologies that have been available to us to create products and services that have included so many new people into the digital ecosystem. Whether they're the agents, over 1 million agents who have now created digital businesses by offering financial services to others, or the hundreds of millions of consumers who are using those agents to access digital services across the continent as well. Everything from being able to pay a bill, withdraw cash, or interact with service providers to get the services that they need. That is one. The second is lending. About 7-8 years ago, getting access to loans from a consumer perspective was extremely difficult, right? Many of the people in the lower rung had to go through the same process to get a loan as a Dangote would use to get a loan with many of the financial institutions. We've changed that trajectory in this industry by creating the ability for customers to access loans using the data that they've generated over time, right? Digital lending started and has now exploded to become one of the fastest growing products or services that the industry offers, with customers being able to access credits in a few seconds to be able to meet their needs or expand their businesses, right? The third example, and I think this is probably as important for us as any of the others, Akosa talked about having steering and brakes. We have been able to tap into data as a way of providing security to mitigate fraud, using the data that is being generated to assess good transactions from bad transactions, good actors from bad actors, to plug the holes that are being exploited by some of the fraudsters in the industry, providing fraud solutions and security as a service. But we're still a long way from where we need to get to. And the question really is why? How do we build what is necessary to bridge the data trust gap? There are 5 points that I would really like to raise to answer that question. The first, I think, is the harmonization of data regulation and data policies. I am very pleased to hear that I think more than 30 countries have actually started putting or have put in place data regulations. The concern I have is this. In Europe, there is GDPR across all the countries in Europe. In Africa, are we going to end up with data policies, data regulations that are not harmonized across each other, right? Shouldn't we be thinking about harmonizing the data policies in a way that allows Africa to harness the full potential of the data that it has? The second is, we talk a lot about data sovereignty, NDPR, GDPR. We cannot have data sovereignty if we do not have data centers, right? We're storing data in private data centers. They are not shareable, they are not available. We're storing data in public clouds, and we're talking about data sovereignty. Can Africa indeed have data sovereignty or claim to have data if we do not build data centers? We need to prioritize investment in data centers. And to do this, I think there's a lot of partnership that needs to happen. The investment that needs to go into building the storage and the compute environment that is required is running into the billions of dollars, right? companies like Google, Microsoft are making that investment. It's one of the reasons why generative AI is possible. We talk a lot about generative AI and the impact it's likely to have on the future, but we are also worried about the kinds of biases that those Gen AIs will have. Why? Because it's being trained using data that does not come from Africa. Right? We cannot address that problem until we have African data in African data centers feeding into those models and allowing us to create AI products that will meet the needs of our people. And I think finally, well, I think two more, then I'll go into the last section. We talk a lot about data, how it works for us as organizations, as businesses, as governments. But at the end of the day, we need to build data. We need to look at data in a way of how it impacts on the consumer, right? And I think there are really two critical examples that I just wanted to share. But the frame is, can we think about how do we create value for the guys, for the individuals, for the businesses that actually own the data? And these are the consumers, right? M-Pesa is a fantastic example of how they've used data to build financial inclusion and increase prosperity for their customers in Kenya and across Africa. Hello Tractor is another fantastic example of how we've used data to create value for those customers, until we begin to think about how we're building product services that create value for the owners of the data, the guys who are generating the data. I think we'll continue to struggle. Right. The last point, before I go into the last section of my slides, is we need to build trust with technology, right? We need to make sure that if people entrust their data to us, we need to secure them. We need to ensure the privacy of that data. We need to ensure that it's used appropriately, in line with regulation, but also in line with ethical considerations, because it's not everything that will be built into regulatory frameworks. We need to be ethical about the way we handle the data that is put in our trust. We need to be willing to be transparent and accountable. We need to be able to provide information to consumers about how we've used their data, where we've used it, where it's stored. And when they request for us to withdraw the use of that data, we need to be able to do that, right? And finally, and I think all the data regulations say this, we need to ensure that the data producers have control over their data. We need to give consent, and we need to trust their consent. And I think my final slide is basically this. The topic, and I think the most important word in the topic is the topic of trust, right? And trust is the glue of life. It binds everything. It's the most important part in any relationships, whether it's in the relationship between service providers and the regulators, service providers and their customers and the people who they interact with and provide their services to. Thank you very much.